Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 5. In this chapter, we get into some very practical issues. And basically, I have kind of an introductory paragraph here. In the first couple of verses, Paul is going to address Timothy's relationship to the congregation in general. His comments there remind me of the old Aretha Franklin song, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, okay? You want to sing it for us? Okay. Timothy's relationship to the congregation, kind of on a general admonition here. And then the care and provision of widows, of true widows, verses 5 through 10. And then what's the will of the Lord for younger widows, verses 11 through 15. And the responsibility even of a widow who has dependent widows in her care, verse 16. And then Paul turns his attention to the responsibilities of the elders, the responsibility of the congregation toward the elders, and verses 17, and that's verses 17 through 20, and then he closes with some personal advice for Timothy, and that's verses 21 through 25. Little historical background that really concerns how the widows are handled. We've got to put ourselves back into a period in history when there were no what we call social safety nets, okay? So if you think about this, we're really greatly blessed to live in a country like we do, where you have social safety nets like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and different things like that people can fall back on, okay? They didn't have that back then. As far as we know, there was basically no such thing as national welfare, food stamps, life insurance, health insurance, retirement and pension plans like IRAs and 401ks, Social Security, nursing homes for the elderly. Basically, none of that existed. So a woman who becomes widowed, okay, is very vulnerable. She has very little that she can turn to for financial support. And so this actually all the way back, you remember back in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 6, even in the Jerusalem church, the early church, there was a problem emerging back then with widows and how to care for them. And in particular in that context, it had to do with the more Greek-oriented culturally widows within the congregation. And it was felt like some of them were being overlooked in the daily distribution of aid for them. And so the church stepped in to address that. And here we find Paul addressing the issue more specifically. So in verses 1 and 2, do not sharply rebuke an older man. In this case, even though the Greek term there is presbyteros, which has been used in chapter 3 for the office of elder, here we think in the context that presbyteros is used in a more general sense of just an older man, likely someone 60 years old and older. And Timothy is advised, okay, don't sharply rebuke him. And the term there, if I can find it, one literal idea of the word is that to actually strike at, okay? Obviously, I don't think that's a problem that Timothy wants to whack him upside the head, but on the other hand, it can mean the idea of reproving or rebuking verbally. And Paul is cautioning Timothy not to address men like that, older men like that, but rather appeal to him as a father. Show them the kind of same respect you would your own father, Timothy. To the younger men as brothers, okay? Treat them as though they are your brother, okay? But we could perhaps add one thought that I think Swindoll adds in his commentary, which is don't follow them, your brothers, into some of the typical follies that brothers like to pursue, okay? Those of you who've ever had a brother, you might understand that. To the older women, again, as mothers, treat them as you would your own mother. Again, and the term RESPECT, okay, it really applies to all of these, doesn't it? And younger women as sisters, treat them as though your sister, but he adds here, in all purity, okay? And I think one of the things that Timothy or anybody who's in a leadership position like that needs to look out for is the temptation with younger women to use perhaps a little sexual tension or attraction as a means of getting what you want out of that person, okay? That's to be avoided. Treat them with all purity. Any comments about that? Okay. Pressing on. Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Okay? First, the very first word there in verse 3, honor, okay, is Paul talking about simply honor and respect, okay? If you go on in the context here, I think it becomes very clear that we're talking more than just showing respect, okay? We're actually talking about supporting them either through financial remuneration or the provision of needs. Now, we've got to think back in a culture like this. For us, it's easy to throw some dollars into the offering plate, okay? And I think we kind of tend to think that way. But we're looking at cultures that perhaps are more agrarian-oriented, and so basics like food, okay? Others can make provision for these widows through supplying food, supplying clothing, perhaps even housing of some kind. So it's not just a simple deed of throwing money into the offering plate. It's really looking out for them, what their needs are, okay? And I'll tell a little story here, even though I don't have time. But quite a few years ago, I had a small business where I basically called myself a handyman, and about, I'd say, 50% of what I did was taking care of yards, yard works, 40% was painting, and about the other 10% was whatever came up, except I wouldn't do electrical because if I did, I'd burn a house down. In doing that, I kind of got my name passed around with a lot of widows, okay? And I began to realize over time, this is not just a job, this is not just a way for me to earn some money. This was a ministry to these widows because they didn't have anybody in their lives to help them take care of those kind of things. And I also came to realize, they're lonely. And so I began to schedule, when I'd go to somebody's house, I would schedule a time, like an extra half hour, after I got my work done, to just sit there with them. And we'd talk about whatever their needs were, whatever they wanted to talk about. That's a very practical way of ministering to widows, I found. So, yeah, John?
It brings to mind if a church body has somebody assigned to go visit widows in a pastoral care ministry, the church body also might have someone that's looking out to, okay, what are their physical needs, so that pastoral care person isn't expected to do the physical needs also.
You explain that. Okay, say it again.
comes to mind if there are people assigned in a church of the ministry to go and minister spiritually to widows, that the church also have in mind a way to serve those widows in these practical handyman sort of ways, so that the one visiting them as a spiritual caretaker is not expected to be in the role of the handyman role as well.
All right. Yeah. In other words, I think part of what John is saying is if somebody's going to minister to a widow more on a spiritual, emotional friend basis, that it's good if the church is kind of keeping track of these widows and perhaps what their physical needs are, so that the person going there to administer to aid to them spiritually isn't suddenly finding themselves, can you fix this leaky faucet for me? Okay? All right. Okay. So anyhow, I think the word honor is clearly in the context is talking about more than just respect. It's actually taking care of their physical needs, okay? And that can involve remuneration, all right? In fact, the word there for honor actually can mean to value. And if you go back, don't have time to do it right now, but if you go all the way back to Leviticus chapter 27, the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Leviticus chapter 27 uses the same word repeatedly. And if you'll take the time to look that up, you'll find that that word has a very solid basis for this idea of remuneration or valuation of some kind. So now she who is a widow, well, let's see. Then verse 4, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Do you notice that, it's clear what he's saying here, and that is the first line of defense for taking care of a widow is not actually the church, it's her family. Okay, back here, Jill.
I feel like it goes back to the Ten Commandments, honor your mother and father.
Exactly.
And love your neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. Love your, Ed?
They were saying charity begins at home.
Charity begins at home. And notice in that verse the association of the children and grandchildren doing that with piety, okay? This is something that in their relationship with the Lord, they need to practice this, okay? And they need to pursue it. And so family really is the first line of defense in caring for these widows, as Paul puts it out here. And he says, this is good, this is acceptable in the sight of God. And then verse 5, now she who is a widow indeed, okay? He's saying those who are a true widow, okay? And he's going to kind of explain that for us. And who has been left alone. Left alone. She's all alone. She doesn't have any children or grandchildren. She doesn't have any immediate family that she can turn to. So she's truly left alone. This is where the church steps in, okay? And she describes, though, and in a way, this is Paul saying this is a qualification, has fixed her hope on God. And she continues in entreaties both by night and by day. Okay? So prayer is a regular part of her life. Okay? She may not be able to get out and earn a living, but prayer is a regular part of her life. So she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. That could be, and there's commentators struggle with this one. I think Swindoll considers the possibility that some of these widows might turn to prostitution because that was basically the only way they could go out and earn some money. I struggle with that one because I have questions about a 60-year-old woman going out and prostituting. So, you draw whatever conclusions you want from that. I'm not going to assert that dogmatically, but the idea is certainly clear, is that the church supporting a woman who is living in a wanton pursuit of pleasure of some kind, okay, that person is not eligible, right? And That goes contrary to our worldly thinking, but this is divine thinking here. Prescribe these things as well so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now that's stated, grammatically that's stated in the masculine, okay? And it's easy to read that and think of a father, a husband, okay? And it certainly applies there, okay? But I think it also reflects the culture. Basically, the males are the breadwinners in this cultural situation. And it goes beyond. We've already seen the principle established. This doesn't apply. The care of the widows goes to family first, and that can extend to the children and the grandchildren. Okay? And so Paul is not saying that just a husband may be worse than an infidel, like an unbeliever, okay? But even children and grandchildren, okay? If they refuse to do what they should be doing, which is, as Jill said, honoring their mother and their father. If they refuse to do that, they're acting like an unbeliever. And that term that Paul uses there, let's see if I can find my note real quickly here. It's like as one who has essentially repudiated or disowned with abiding results the teachings of the faith. It's like they were somebody who repudiated the teachings of the faith. That's strong, okay? And I think maybe we struggle with some of this. But Paul goes on to say, verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list. And that strongly suggests, obviously suggests, that the church at Ephesus was keeping a list of women who are widows that they were considering for support of some kind, right? And Paul's saying a widow is to be put on the list if, okay? And he gives two very objective criteria. One is if she is not less than 60 years old. She can't be less than 60 years old, right? Number two, having been the wife of one man. And in the Greek, that's a one-husband wife. A one-husband wife. Very similar, but reversed from what we saw over in chapter 3 in the requirements for elders and deacons who were a one-wife husband, okay? And so in this context here, I think it really helps us understand maybe what Paul was getting back to in chapters 3, or at least it influences the interpretation of that, because here I think it's quite clear that what Paul means is that she's only married once. Only married once. Now we might ask ourselves, well, what about, her first husband passed away, she remarried, there's nothing wrong biblically with remarriage after the spouse has passed away. So why would she be penalized for getting remarried at some point and then becoming a widow again? One of the answers I would suggest for that is that if she's remarried, that has opened the door to more family to support her, okay? More extended family is brought into the picture there. So anyhow, he goes on to say, and then he gets into more subjective evaluation here. Having a reputation for good works, and I want to point out here, second paragraph on the back of the second page, verses 9 through 16. Each of these characteristics, about halfway through that paragraph, each of these characteristics that he gives also indicates a certain kind of attribute, okay? So a reputation for good works, I think, indicates diligence. The physical and spiritual rearing of children indicates dedication and faithfulness. The demonstration of hospitality shows her generosity. The washing the feet of the saints demonstrates her humility. The helping of those in distress, her compassion. You see the pattern here? The devotion to every good work, discipline. There's discipline behind that. Effectively, I think this list, Paul is saying the church should use it. Timothy should use this, and the elders of the church should use this in evaluating what widows are going to be supported. And effectively, this eliminates what I would call, sorry to be mean here, deadbeats, hucksters, or anyone who tries to take advantage of the system. And I say this because, again, years ago, having been involved in a small church startup here, as soon as the word got out that there's a new church in town, we started getting calls left and right from people. But most of them, I would say, are deadbeats, wanting a handout. But really the attitude, it was the attitude that really bothered me, which seemed to be an attitude, and at least part of the culture out there, that the church is obligated to be a welfare agency. Okay? And now some of them were a little better. They would come up with something like, well, if you'll help pay half my electric bill, I'll come over to your house and I'll wash the windows on your car, okay? And they at least recognized a little bit that there is a principle of work there, okay? They should exercise and work. I ran across a man who worked for the state of Colorado here in town, and apparently his job had him in contact with a lot of these kind of people that make a regular living, so to speak, off of peddling, we'll say. And he knew all these people by name. And I'd go in and tell him something about, well, I got contacted by so-and-so who wanted such and such. And he'd say, well, what's the name? I'd give him a name. And he said, okay, I know that guy. That's his line. That's what he always does, okay? They're out there, okay? And the church, leadership at the church has to be very discerning about this. And it's not easy, okay? Pastor Joe, Jeff, you know, right? Yeah, it's not easy to be discerning. And you have to be really careful about extending aid to such people and doing it in such a way that they cannot take what's given and abuse it, okay? All right.
Verse 10 is kind of a job description for a godly widow.
Yeah, John says verse 10 is like a job description for a godly woman, a godly widow. Yeah, that's well put. Well, he goes on, verse 11. What about younger widows? Okay, Paul says flat out, don't put them on the list. And Paul, when I look at the grammar and the language that Paul uses here, I get the distinct impression that Paul's advice is based on experience. Okay, what he says in the following context, based on experience. Refuse to put the younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires and disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. We don't know for sure what that previous pledge is that he's referring to. However, some suggestions are, let's see if I can find it. Well, in the summary on the back of page 2, verse 11, the issue turns to younger widows. You get a strong impression about how Paul handles this. That he speaks from personal experience. He doesn't want them placed on the list because the younger women are, in general, are more likely to follow their passion for. This is how I put it: their passion for love and intimacy with a husband. And they value marriage and relationship over any commitment they have made to Christ. Okay? So in verse 12, the pledge that they have set aside could be, one possibility, a formal commitment to remain single in order to receive assistance as a widow, which they might, Paul is anticipating, though younger women will probably violate that at some point. Or secondly, a vow to Christ to serve without remarriage. Okay. John has a third one.
Marrying a non-Christian.
Marrying a non-Christian. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. All of which would be out of line with God's will. And apparently, and again, I think Paul has seen this happen. And that's why he's given this advice here. And to break a vow, that incurs condemnation. That incurs judgment. You're going, if you break a vow to God then you go under his discipline. Okay? At the same time, verse 13, they also learn to be idle. They go around from house to house, not merely idle, but in going from house to house, they're talking to other women, they're gossiping, they become busybodies. They start sticking their nose into people's business that they have no business sticking their nose into. Okay? And they talk about things that are things that should not be discussed. Okay? There's such as family matters. They're going from one house to another to talk and say to the lady in such and such a house, she finds out about certain things going on in that house, and she starts repeating that. She's not supposed to do that. That's gossip. That's not proper to do. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married. Now, obviously, Paul can't command that, can he? Okay? He can't command that, but he's saying, this is what the Lord would prefer. This is what I, Paul, would prefer. That they get married, they bear children, they keep house, they give the enemy no occasion for reproach by their behavior. Right? And that word there, keep house, does anybody have a different translation of that? Anybody? No, okay. Manage a household. It's interesting because that word there literally means to be a house ruler or master of the house. That's kind of neat. That basically says that God wants her to be in control of what's going on in that house. That's her responsibility. That's what she does before the Lord. Okay? That gives her a lot of purpose. But at the same time, it says, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent... Now here we go, last possibility. Here's a woman who's a widow herself, I think is what he's saying here, who has other widows in her care. Maybe somebody like Lydia. Remember Lydia in Philippi? She's a dealer in purple. She's a successful businesswoman. As far as we know, she's a widow or she's single, one or the other, okay? And maybe some other widows could come under her care. And Paul is saying, okay, the church doesn't take care of those. If you can take care of them, if you have the means as a widow to take care of others, you should do that, okay? Again, the church is not always the first line of defense. All right. Any comments? We got through that. Okay, John.
Well, just in talking about this, I think what Paul is talking about is enrolling them in the church social security program.
Okay.
It didn't preclude on a spot basis, on a case-by-case basis, issuing benevolence to help a person that was in a moment in a jam and needed some help.
Okay.
He was talking about putting them on the church social security program.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, this is a list that they apparently kept, and they would be enrolled on it for the duration. Okay, question back. Was that Sharon back there?
I think with the younger widows, it gives them permission to remarry, and it gives them, that they won't be under condemnation, or it's right here in God's word for the younger widows. If a marriage comes up and she could step into a marriage, and I appreciate that.
Okay, yeah, it is a reassurance to younger widows that, yeah, they're widows, okay, they've lost their husband. There's no condemnation if they go into another marriage. Yeah. Okay, Pastor Joe?
I think the church can have a real vital part in aiding the widow to do these things. We could keep a list of family members that need to be contacted if some of them contact you. You know, we could share prayer requests with the widows to pray.
Mhm.
So they could have a prayer ministry. There are ministries they could do that the church could help facilitate that.
Yes, and we have a group here of widows trying to help widows like that, don't we? Okay. All right. That's something the church should be aware of. Yeah, Corey?
I agree so much with what John said because I feel like I know what it's like to be down and out and have someone help me without even questioning how I got in that position. And I think here he's talking about, like I said, a continuous care of the church. But to match this idea up with the what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me, and Jesus feeding thousands of people without questioning why they need it, and
Mm-hmm.
healing people that obviously were in that position because of their sins. And I think as Christians, if we're going to err on the side of charity or whatever you want to call it, probably we're better off in erring on giving something that wasn't deserved as saying you don't deserve it. So there has to be a difference between the church supporting someone
Yeah.
and then we're responsible for that, or we see somebody in the, on the street or whatever, and yeah, maybe they're going to waste what we give them, but maybe we have opened an opportunity to help them spiritually. So I think let's be very careful that in applying this, we're not becoming hard-hearted.
Yeah, and I agree with you, okay? And the word grace is what comes to my mind, okay? We are to practice grace. And I think John is right in keeping us focused on the fact that this is a list of widows that's being devised, if you will, for this church here, okay? In either case, I don't see anything in here where Paul says, now I want you to go back into their past and find out about all the bad things they ever done or all the stupid things they ever did, because well, yeah, actually you do have one here. He talks about, in verse 11, when he talks about feel sensual desire. Let's see, is that the one? I forget the exact phrase in the English, but he talks about sensual desires, and that could be translated as living luxuriously. Okay? Wanton pleasure, that was it. Yeah, okay. Wanton pleasure. And wanton pleasure has the idea of living luxuriously. In other words, they had resources and they blew it, okay? They blew all the money, okay? Somebody who has the propensity to do that, a little red flag ought to go up here. If the church gives them something, what are they going to do with it, okay? So there's that balance, okay, of questioning, but what about grace, okay? Ed?
Today, though, we have, maybe they did then too, we have a nuance, it's called addiction. And anybody who's ever dealt with somebody who's in active addiction, love looks completely different. And in that case, to help that person, like you said, without questioning, maybe usually that's damaging for the addict. Because it's going to further their addiction.
Yeah, the term we use today is enabling, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that is something to be wise to.
Yes.
And because you can absolutely harm that person in thinking that you're helping them. And so I think that's a nuance that I'd like to believe Paul didn't have to deal with
Okay.
in that day. But we absolutely have to deal with it today. Most everybody who's panhandling on the side of the road, they're in active addiction.
Yeah.
I would argue that the majority of them are in active addiction. If you give them money, so ask them, they say they're hungry.
Yeah.
We'll say, okay, well, how about we go over here to McDonald's, I'll buy you some food. See if they'll do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if they say they want to work, offer them work.
Mhm.
And you'll find out very quickly.
See if they show up. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Virtually out of time. Okay. The elders who rule well, to be considered worthy of double honor. Okay. My interpretation of that is very literal, and I think Paul is saying basically whatever you give the widows, give the elders twice as much. Okay? And I'll point out something here real quickly, but we've got to end it here. in Judaism, as far as I understand it, the practice in Judaism and the synagogues, okay, the synagogues had a synagogue ruler, they had other elders, they had other officials that administered different functions in the synagogue. As far as I can find, none of them received any direct compensation for doing that. So what Paul is introducing here, I think especially for the Jews within the church of Ephesus, this is a new concept to them. Okay? New concept to them. And so that's why he backs it up in verse 18 with two scriptures. Okay? You shall not muzzle the ox while he's threshing the grain. Okay? In other words, the ox is grinding out all of this grain, and the ox or the cow or whatever wants to reach down and eat some of that. Okay? And you shouldn't muzzle them so that they can't do that. Right? Very simple concept. And then the laborer is worthy of his wages. And Paul is saying, he's saying elders that rule in the church, they are laborers and they are worthy of wages, being compensated for that. Okay? So think on that, and maybe we can wrap it up some other time. Okay?
We are, of course, having the budget meeting today.
Yeah, we're having the budget meeting today. So yeah, and I'm sure there'll be some discussion about that. All right, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for the magnificence of your word. As always, the more time I spend in this, the more I appreciate the precision of the language that you chose to write this in. There's little nuances that are just wonderful to pick up on, that tell us things that kind of help us read between the lines. And so we thank you for that. We thank you for that revelation. We thank you for the guidance here. We pray that it might be applied in this fellowship to your glory in Jesus' name. Amen.